Harrison Ford, a timeless name in the history of Hollywood. The man who once carried entire galaxies on his shoulders as Han Solo in Star Wars, and who redefined what it means to be a hero as Indiana Jones. He is not just an actor. He is the eternal face of adventure, the heartbeat of an entire generation's dreams, the living proof that courage can overcome the impossible. That gravelly voice, those piercing eyes, that undeniable presence, they are carved into the eternity of cinema. Yet, behind the blinding glow of fame, behind those immortal roles etched forever into popular culture, lies a very different Harrison Ford, a man of flesh and blood who has weathered storms fierce enough to bring anyone to their knees. He rose from the ashes of broken marriages. He carried the unbearable weight of watching his beloved daughter battle the merciless grip of epilepsy. He survived the chilling moment when his own plane plummeted from the sky, leaving him with scars, some visible, some hidden, that would remain for life. Every wound, every fracture, every silent ache tells a story that the spotlight could never shield him from. But just like the heroes he brought to life on screen, Ford never surrendered. Scarred, yes. Shaken, often. But defeated? Never. He carried within him the spirit of a man who refuses to let tragedy define him. And now at the age of 83, a haunting question lingers. Is there still a deeper sorrow? What unseen pain follows this living legend in the twilight of his life? There was a time when Harrison Ford's greatest battle wasn't against villains, monsters, or empires. It wasn't on a film set at all. His very first struggle was against the crushing silence of his own childhood, a silence so suffocating it nearly smothered him before he could even begin. Harrison was born on July 13, 1942 in Chicago, into a family where art flowed through the veins. His father, Christopher, had once pursued acting. His mother, Dorothy, had been a radio singer. By all appearances, destiny seemed to prepare the boy for the stage. And yet, the child who would one day command galaxies as Han Solo, who would redefine heroism as Indiana Jones, grew up imprisoned by something deeply personal, a shyness so heavy, so paralyzing, that it felt like an invisible cage. Looking back decades later, Ford admitted with striking honesty, "I was a very shy kid. I felt like I didn't really fit in anywhere." By the early 1950s, when he was only 10 years old, that shyness had already carved scars into him. With a Jewish mother and an Irish Catholic father, Ford inherited a complex identity that gave him resilience, but also restlessness. He often felt like he belonged to no world at all, caught between cultures, between expectations, between the desperate desire to belong and the cruel reality of always standing on the outside. He remembered standing at the edge of classrooms and playgrounds, watching other children form bonds, laugh, and play together, while he lingered like a shadow, present but unseen. That loneliness carved itself deep into his early years, leaving him with an ache he would carry for the rest of his life. And yet, even in those quiet shadows, the seeds of adventure had already begun to take root. At 13 years old, as a Boy Scout, Ford discovered the vastness of the outdoors, the whisper of trees, the calm of still lakes, the infinite skies stretching above him. Nature gave him something school never could: escape. Those moments of freedom would foreshadow the passions that later defined his adulthood: the love of flying, the solace of open landscapes, the hunger for the skies. But the moment he returned to the classroom, the walls of shyness closed in once more, reminding him he was still a prisoner of his own silence. In his teenage years, the struggle grew sharper. Teachers described him as a boy with poor grades and fragile confidence, someone always a step behind. And when he entered Ripon College in Wisconsin in the early 1960s, it felt as though the weight of failure was crushing him. He studied philosophy, but instead of finding meaning, He felt himself drowning. His academic record was so poor he nearly flunked out. He would wander the hallways invisible, lost, a young man who seemed destined not for greatness, but for obscurity. "I wasn't a good student," Ford later confessed. "I didn't feel like I belonged." The same shadows of his childhood still haunted him, whispering that perhaps he would never escape. The young man who would one day inspire millions with his courage seemed, at that moment, to stand at the edge of defeat. And then, almost by accident, came the spark. In his final year at Ripon, Harrison enrolled in a drama class, not because he dreamed of becoming an actor, but out of desperation, a last attempt to break free from the shackles of silence. On stage, trembling yet determined, he discovered something that had been buried inside him all along. A voice. For the very first time, the invisible boy was seen. For the very first time, the world began, however faintly, to hear him. The pain of those years, the loneliness, the isolation, the feeling of not belonging, did not vanish. But they forged something stronger, something unbreakable. Every line he would later deliver, every daring role he would embody, carried the echoes of that silent childhood. The world would come to know Harrison Ford as a fearless hero. But only he knew the truth. His greatest victory began not with fame, not with adventure, but with the agonizing struggle to escape the shadows of his own silence. In 1964, at just 22 years old, Harrison Ford arrived in Hollywood. He didn't come with glory, wealth, or connections. He came with an old car, fragile hope, and the desperate belief that maybe, just maybe, the city of dreams would notice him. Columbia Pictures gave him a contract for $150 a week, a number that seemed for a fleeting moment like a golden key. But the reality was far more devastating. His roles were little more than shadows. Nameless faces flickering across screens, forgotten before the credits even rolled. The boy who had once battled the suffocating silence of childhood now found himself swallowed by an even crueler silence. The silence of being unseen in a city where everyone came to be remembered. Years later, Ford recalled the humiliation of auditions where judgment fell before he even opened his mouth. "I'd walk in, and they'd decide I wasn't right before I even said a word." That kind of rejection cut deeper than letters of refusal. Hollywood had no mercy for the invisible. And yet, life was moving forward whether Ford succeeded or not. That same year, he married Mary Marquardt. Soon, he was not only an actor chasing a dream, but also a husband and eventually the father of 2 children. Fatherhood filled his heart, but it also shackled him with a weight he could barely carry. Dreams could not buy diapers. Dreams could not pay rent. By his late 20s, his life fell into a brutal rhythm. Auditions by day, rejection by night, and the unbearable silence of his children's eyes asking questions he had no answers for. Out of sheer necessity, he turned to carpentry. Self-taught, he learned to cut, sand, and shape wood with the same precision he had once dreamed of bringing to acting. Carpentry paid the bills, but every table he built, every door he repaired felt like a coffin for the dream that had once driven him west. "I felt like a failure," he would later admit, "like I had no business being an actor." As the early 1970s unfolded, Ford entered his 30s. While his peers' names were already blazing across marquees, he was still a ghost in the city of stars. Each blow of the hammer in his workshop grew heavier, not just with wood, but with the crushing weight of responsibility. And yet, even among the sawdust and despair, something within him refused to die. By building cabinets for Hollywood's elite, Ford unknowingly kept himself tethered to the very world that had shut him out. Then in 1973, at age 31, destiny cracked open a door. George Lucas cast him in a small role in American Graffiti. The part was modest, almost forgettable, but to Ford it was a spark of proof he was not born to remain invisible. Still, the years between American Graffiti and 1976 were a purgatory, half carpenter, half actor. Survival and destiny pulling him in two opposite directions. Every scar from that invisible decade, every humiliation, every heartbreak, every splinter of failure, was forging the steel of a man who would soon be impossible to overlook. And then, in the most unlikely way imaginable, fate came knocking through carpentry itself. In the mid-1970s, while working on cabinets for a young filmmaker's office, Ford found himself in the orbit of George Lucas once again. Lucas was casting for a strange little space opera that no one truly believed would succeed. Ford walked into that room, not as a star, but as a carpenter desperate to make ends meet. He walked out as Han Solo. With Star Wars in 1977, the carpenter vanished. The legend was born. Overnight, his smirk, his swagger, and his presence became the heartbeat of rebellion across galaxies. The Invisible Man had finally been seen. With the release of Star Wars in 1977, Harrison Ford's life changed forever. One moment he was repairing cabinets, the next he was piloting the Millennium Falcon. Overnight, his smirk, his roguish charm, and his undeniable swagger turned him into the face of rebellion for an entire generation. Han Solo wasn't just a role, he was a phenomenon. Across the world, fans cheered the daring smuggler with the heart of gold, and Ford himself finally stepped out from the shadows of invisibility. For the first time, he wasn't just another struggling actor in Hollywood. He was seen. But destiny wasn't finished with him. Just 4 years later, in 1981, lightning struck again with Raiders of the Lost Ark. With whip in hand and fedora tilted against the blazing sun, Ford gave the world Indiana Jones, a hero unlike any before. He wasn't perfect. He stumbled. He bled. He feared snakes. And yet, that was what made him so unforgettable. Indiana Jones didn't just capture imaginations, he redefined adventure itself. He became a cultural earthquake, stitched into the very fabric of the 20th century. With Han Solo and Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford wasn't just carrying films, he was carrying entire mythologies. Yet as he himself once admitted, you don't get to walk away from them, they follow you everywhere. The roles that crowned him untouchable also chained him. To the world he was eternal, but to himself he sometimes felt swallowed by the very myths that made him immortal. And still, Ford refused to be caged by franchises alone. He sought to prove he was more than a blockbuster face. In Blade Runner, 1982, he carried the melancholy weight of a man questioning the very nature of humanity. In Witness 1985, his quiet intensity earned him an Academy Award nomination, showing critics he was more than just action and stunts. In The Fugitive, 1993, he turned desperation into defiance, becoming the face of justice on the run. In Air Force One, 1997, he embodied America's strength and resolve, commanding the screen as a president who would not yield. Every role layered upon the other, building not just a career, but an empire of emotion and myth. By the 1990s, Harrison Ford was among the highest-grossing actors in history, his films earning more than $9 billion worldwide. From earning $10,000 for the first Star Wars to $65 million for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, his paychecks reflected his meteoric rise. The boy who once trembled in silence, invisible in classrooms, now stood as a cornerstone of cinema, a name carved into eternity. But beneath the thunder of applause, the old silence returned. Fame had lifted him higher than he ever imagined, yet it also wrapped him in a mask he could never remove. To the world he was invincible, the smuggler, the archaeologist, the president, the fugitive. Always outrunning danger, always conquering death. But in the quiet of his private life, Harrison Ford wrestled with a harsher truth. He had become more symbol than self, more monument than man. The paradox of his life was clear. He had conquered the world, but in doing so, he became a legend. Even he could never escape. Fame had crowned Harrison Ford a global icon. But in the shadows of that triumph, his personal life was unraveling. When Harrison married Mary Marquardt in 1964, he was not a star. He was a 22-year-old dreamer, a struggling actor who often came home with rejection in his eyes and doubt in his voice. Mary was there through it all. She worked tirelessly. She believed when no one else did, and she carried their family through years of poverty and disappointment. For more than a decade, she was his anchor. She endured the days when carpentry, not acting, paid the bills. She was the one who held the family together, while Harrison questioned whether his dream was foolish. She was, in every sense, his net when the world let him fall. But in 1977, everything changed. Star Wars exploded into a worldwide phenomenon. Almost overnight, the man who had once been invisible became one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. To millions, he was the daring Han Solo, the embodiment of rebellion and courage. But to Mary, he suddenly became a stranger, a man claimed not by her, but by the world. She had once shared him with failure. Now she was forced to share him with fame. And fame, unlike failure, is merciless. Nights grew longer, distances grew wider. The intimacy that had once bound them dissolved into silence. You don't get to walk away from those roles, Ford later reflected. And Mary knew that all too well, because it wasn't just the roles he couldn't walk away from, it was also her. Then came the whispers, the rumors. Stories of a fleeting affair with Carrie Fisher, his Star Wars co-star. Whether true or gossip, the whispers cut Mary deeply. It wasn't only about betrayal. It was the realization that the dream she had once sacrificed so much for had turned against her. She had endured his invisibility, but she could not endure his immortality. By 1979, their marriage ended. 15 years of devotion dissolved not in shouting, but in silence, the kind of silence that echoes longest. Their two sons, Ben and Willard, witnessed their family split under the glare of Hollywood lights. For them, the father the world worshipped was also the father who could not keep their home together. For Mary, it was devastation without an audience. Her grief lived in the shadows, even as the world celebrated her husband's rise. For Ford, it was a wound rarely spoken of, perhaps because every memory of Mary was also a mirror, showing him both the man she had believed in and the man who let her go. Behind the swagger of Han Solo, behind the defiance of Indiana Jones, there was a quieter, crueler truth. His first great love had been sacrificed on the altar of fame. It was the paradox of his life. He could conquer galaxies on screen, yet in his own home, he lost the battle that mattered most. If Mary Marquardt had been the partner of Harrison Ford's obscurity, then Melissa Mathison was the partner of his triumph. Melissa was not just anyone. She was a gifted screenwriter, the creative force behind E.T., a story about connection, loss, and the longing for home. In 1983, she and Ford married. For a time, it seemed Harrison had finally found his second chance at peace. Their home was filled with warmth and laughter. They welcomed two children, Malcolm and Georgia. And for fleeting years, the man who had grown up in loneliness finally felt what it meant to belong. But even in this new chapter, shadows crept in. Their daughter Georgia was diagnosed with epilepsy, and with that diagnosis came a kind of pain no fame, no fortune, no heroic role could shield him from. The man who had spent decades portraying indestructible heroes now found himself powerless against his own child's seizures. Friends recalled how his voice would fall quiet whenever he spoke about Georgia's illness, as though words themselves could not carry the weight of his helplessness. In desperation, Ford auctioned off one of his most iconic possessions, his Han Solo jacket, to fund epilepsy research. To the world, it was an act of generosity, but to Harrison, it was something closer to begging. It was the plea of a father clawing at the darkness, trying to bargain with the universe for his daughter's health. Melissa carried the pain differently. She became the steadfast guardian of their daughter's fragile health, even as the strain of illness and Ford's long absences for film began to wear away at their marriage. By the late 1990s, the cracks could no longer be ignored. Ford, consumed by fame and the relentless demands of his career, seemed farther away than ever. Melissa, brilliant and accomplished in her own right, found herself increasingly isolated, living in the shadow of a man the world adored, but who was often absent for her. In 2004, after over 20 years together, their marriage ended. The divorce settlement made headlines at $85 million, but the true cost could never be measured in money. For Melissa, it was the heartbreak of watching 2 decades of love dissolve into silence. For Ford, it was the loss of another family, another reminder that he could conquer galaxies on screen, but not the fragile sanctuary of a home. Yet fate was not done with its cruelty. In 2015, more than a decade after their divorce, Melissa Matheson was diagnosed with neuroendocrine cancer. Within months, she was gone at only 65 years old. By then, Ford had remarried, but the news hollowed him. Those who knew him best described him as diminished, as though grief had finally broken through the armor of myth. Melissa had been more than an ex-wife. She had been the witness to his transformation, the years when a struggling carpenter became a global legend. She was the mother of his children, the partner of his greatest ascent. Her death was not just another Hollywood headline, it was the erasure of a piece of himself. Friends say that when Melissa died, Harrison fell silent in a way few had ever seen. He rarely spoke of her afterward, and when he did, his words came slowly, his pauses long, as though every syllable risked reopening a wound he had learned to carry in silence. To those who truly knew him, that silence was louder than words. It was the silence of a man who had lost twice, once to divorce and once to death. A father who had begged fate in vain. A legend who could not save the one who had once stood beside him. For a man who had survived plane crashes, broken bones, and death-defying stunts, this was the blow that no heroism could withstand. Some loves are written to last a lifetime. Others burn fiercely for only a season, leaving echoes far longer than their flame. For Harrison Ford, one of the most haunting chapters of his private life was a secret 3-month affair with his Star Wars co-star, Carrie Fisher. It was 1976, on the set of a strange, low-budget space opera no one truly believed would succeed. Amid the chaos of costumes, rewrites, and sleepless nights in London, Ford, then 34 years old, a husband and father, and Fisher, only 19, brilliant, sharp, and heartbreakingly vulnerable, slipped into their own hidden orbit. On screen, they were Han and Leia, trading barbs and burning glances. Off-screen, fiction bled into reality. The chemistry the world adored was not entirely an act. For Ford, Carrie was an escape. Laughter and lightness in the middle of suffocating responsibility and a failing marriage. For Fisher, Ford was gravity itself, steady, mysterious, intoxicating. She later confessed in her memoir, "It was intoxicating, but it could never last." Their affair lasted only 3 months, but in its brevity lay its ferocity. Behind the cameras, they stole hours the world would never know. Whispers in dressing rooms, lingering looks that blurred the line between performance and truth. Carrie herself admitted she often wondered whether some of those fiery glances, caught on film, carried more honesty than acting. Both of them knew it had an expiration date. When the cameras stopped rolling, so would their fragile orbit. Ford returned to his life. Fisher drifted back into hers. They carried fragments of each other, but the world remained oblivious. For 40 years, the secret stayed buried. Carrie kept her silence, perhaps because the wound never truly healed, or perhaps because some truths are too fragile to live in daylight. Only in 2016, months before her death, did she finally reveal the affair in her memoir, The Princess Diarist. She wrote not with bitterness, but with longing, as though releasing a ghost she had carried for too long. Harrison, true to his nature, remained quiet. He offered no denials, no justifications. His silence was its own confession, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had shared. And then came the cruelest ending. In December 2016, Carrie Fisher died suddenly at just 60 years old. For millions, it was the loss of Princess Leia, the rebel who had taught generations to fight. For Ford, it was something far sharper, the silencing of a woman who had once seen him not as a legend, but as a man. He released only a brief statement. She was one of a kind, brilliant, original, funny. But those who knew him best recognized the grief hidden behind those restrained words. Some silences weigh more than any speech, and Ford carried this one like a wound that would never close. Carrie had not been his anchor like Mary, nor his partner in triumph like Melissa. She was something else entirely, a secret flame, fragile and reckless, that burned brightly and then vanished, leaving only shadows. To the world, Han and Leia remain eternal lovers in a galaxy far, far away. But for Harrison Ford, the story was heavier. For 3 months, fiction became reality. And when reality ended, it left behind an ache that never truly disappeared. After decades marked by heartbreak, broken marriages, and losses that left wounds too deep to heal, fate seemed to finally grow weary of tormenting Harrison Ford. In the early 2000s, it offered him something different. Not another storm, but a harbor. He found it in Callista Flockhart. The two met in 2002 at a Golden Globes party. It was a collision of worlds no one expected. She was the younger star of Ally McBeal, known for her wit, charm, and delicate presence. He was the grizzled Hollywood legend carrying the weight of myth and the scars of a life lived too loudly in the public eye. Yet when their eyes met, there was something disarmingly simple between them. No performance, no pretense, just a quiet connection. Ford later admitted that it wasn't her fame that drew him in, but her kindness, her warmth, the way she made the noise of Hollywood seem far away. Their love grew quietly, deliberately, away from the cameras. By then, Ford was in his 60s, old enough to know the difference between passion's blaze and love's endurance. With Callista, it was endurance. They never had children together, but family, as Ford discovered, could be chosen. Callista had already adopted a son, Liam, before meeting him, and Harrison, scarred though he was by the wounds of complicated fatherhood, embraced the boy as his own. It wasn't biology that bound them, but devotion. Friends noticed something remarkable. Ford, once restless and hardened, seemed to soften. The man who had carried so much loneliness now settled into something gentler, a second chance, not only at love, but at fatherhood. This time shaped by choice, not by circumstance. In 2010, they married in a quiet, private ceremony in Santa Fe, New Mexico. No flashing cameras, no grand gestures, just two people choosing each other. Soon after, they made their home on a sprawling ranch in Wyoming, far from the glare of Hollywood. There, Ford traded red carpets for open skies. His mornings began on horseback, his evenings by the fire, the sound of Liam's laughter echoing across the fields. For decades, his life had been defined by premieres, paychecks, and the relentless demands of fame. But now it was defined by presence, by dinners at the table, by the simple rhythm of family. Of course, trials still came. In 2015, when Ford's plane crashed on a Los Angeles golf course, the world held its breath. Many believed it was the end. Callista, however, stayed by his side every moment. Later, when asked how she endured the terror, she answered with only 3 words: "I love him." Perhaps that is the essence of this chapter. For a man whose earlier loves had been scarred by distance, fame, and tragedy, Callista brought something rare: presence. Not the whirlwind of passion, not the ghost of regret, not the myth that followed him everywhere, just a steady flame warming the cold places his past had left behind. Today their marriage stands as one of Hollywood's few anomalies, enduring, private, untouched by scandal. For Harrison Ford, Callista Flockhart was never simply a third wife. She became something far greater, the harbor where, after a lifetime of storms, his heart could finally rest. For decades, Harrison Ford built his legend on indestructibility. He was the man who never stayed down, the rogue who outran empires, the archaeologist who cheated death with only a whip and a grin. His body was his greatest ally, lean, tireless, and fearless. But legends are written in celluloid, not in flesh. And flesh, no matter how strong, eventually betrays. The betrayals began quietly, as aches and bruises from years of defying gravity with his own stunts. Ford had always insisted on authenticity. If Indiana Jones was to dangle from a truck or wrestle atop a speeding train, it had to be him. Stunt doubles were not his creed. Authenticity was. That stubbornness won him generations of admiration, but it left behind a map of scars no camera would ever capture. Torn ligaments, cracked bones, muscles healed badly but forced to move again. By his 70s, every stride carried the weight of old battles. Every breath whispered the cost of refusing to bend. And then, in June 2014, the illusion of invincibility shattered on the set of Star Wars. The Force Awakens, inside the cockpit of the very Millennium Falcon that had carried him to immortality, disaster struck. A hydraulic door malfunctioned and came crashing down, shattering his leg, and pinning him beneath the ship that had made him a legend. For the stunned crew, the sight was unbearable. Han Solo, broken, not by stormtroopers or blasters, but by steel and machinery. Production halted, silence filled the studio, and the myth lay wounded before their eyes. Ford was rushed into surgery. Later, on television, he laughed it off, joking with a toy model of the Falcon. But those who were there never forgot the truth. The ship that made him eternal had also revealed his fragility. Barely a year later, the illusion cracked wider. In March 2015, while flying one of his beloved vintage planes, Ford suffered catastrophic engine failure. His aircraft plummeted from the sky and slammed into a Los Angeles golf course. The wreckage was mangled beyond recognition. For terrifying minutes, the world believed the story had ended. News bulletins exploded. Was this how the legend would finally fall? At the hospital, Callista Flockhart waited in anguish, believing she might lose him forever. "I thought I'd lost him," she later confessed. To the world, his survival was a miracle. To Callista, it was a resurrection. Yet survival came with a shadow. Ford had stared into mortality's abyss and returned. Not unscarred, not unchanged, but altered. He walked again. He flew again. He even returned to the sets that demanded his blood and sweat. But there was something different in his eyes. Beneath the gravelly humor and stoic shrugs lay a quiet admission. His body was no longer invincible. And still, the body asked more. In 2021, at nearly 80 years old, while rehearsing a fight scene for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Ford tore his shoulder. Production shut down for weeks as he endured surgery and painful rehabilitation. The irony was cruel. Indiana Jones, once the eternal adventurer, was undone not by snakes, curses, or collapsing temples, but by time itself. When filming finally resumed, cameras captured the truth. His frame was leaner, his movements slower, his face marked by both triumph and suffering. And yet when the director called action, something inside him still ignited. For fleeting moments he was Indy again, defying time with every narrowed gaze, every swing of the whip. In public, Ford shrugged off questions about aging with his trademark wit. It beats the alternative. But those closest to him knew better. Callista noticed the stiffness when he rose, the careful pauses in his steps, the late-night stirring from old pains. For the first time, the man who had once embodied eternal youth now lived in a body that betrayed him daily. And so, when he appeared at Cannes 2023 for the premiere of Indy's final adventure, the applause that thundered through the theater carried more than celebration. It carried farewell. Fans were not only honoring Indiana Jones, they were saying goodbye to a man who had given them his body piece by piece until it could give no more. What makes his story so profoundly human is not the illusion of indestructibility, but the truth of his fragility. Every scar, every surgery, every crash was not a failure. It was a sacrifice. Proof of a man who refused to retreat, who chose to spend himself completely for the sake of his art, and for us. And perhaps that is why, even in frailty, he remains luminous, because his fragility only makes his resilience burn brighter. At 83 years old, Harrison Ford lives in a world that few could ever imagine. His net worth climbs past $300 million. His name is tied to sprawling properties, a luxurious Brentwood estate in Los Angeles, a Manhattan penthouse overlooking the skyline, and his beloved 800-acre ranch in Wyoming, half of which he donated to conservation. He owns Jaguars rich with history, Mercedes built for speed, Teslas that glide in silence, and private jets, including a Cessna Sovereign worth more than some people will earn in a lifetime. To the outside world, it looks like the portrait of ultimate victory. The boy who once built cabinets to pay the rent now commands an empire. And yet, those who know him best understand the irony. Harrison Ford has never lived smaller, quieter, or more withdrawn. On that Wyoming ranch, far from Hollywood lights, he has found something he once thought impossible: stillness. He walks the land in boots, tends to the silence, and finds comfort in the rhythm of nature. He has built an empire, but what he seeks now is not more. It is less noise, less demand, less performance. His home is with Callista Flockhart, the woman who has stood by him for more than 2 decades, and with Liam, the son she adopted before their marriage, whom Ford long ago embraced as his own. There are no new children born of this marriage, no distractions from old regrets. Instead, there is something quieter, perhaps more precious. Redemption, dinner at the ranch, laughter by the fire, the gift of presence after a lifetime of absence. But even in this sanctuary, the body tells its truths. His leg stiffens with the memory of the Millennium Falcon's crushing door in 2014. His shoulder aches with the injury that almost halted Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Each step is slower, each movement more deliberate. He still works out. He still flies his planes. He still maintains the discipline of a man who refuses to yield. But every reflection whispers the same truth. The indestructible man has grown old. At Cannes 2023, when Ford stood before roaring crowds for Indy's last adventure, the moment was more than a celebration. It was a farewell. His eyes glistened with tears. His voice trembled as he admitted, "I'm deeply moved." It was gratitude, yes, but it was also goodbye. And yet, even as time claims its due, Ford continues to give himself away. Not to box office glory, but to causes larger than himself. As Vice Chair of Conservation International, he has fought for rainforests, rivers, and the survival of the natural world. He has lent his voice to environmental campaigns, donated land, and spoken truths that many prefer to ignore. Long before activism was fashionable, he used his wealth to preserve something greater than himself. And there is the Private Ford, the man who, in his helicopter, once rescued stranded hikers and lost climbers. A man who has literally saved lives, far away from cameras, applause, or headlines. Still, wealth cannot shield him from memory. He has outlived friends, colleagues, and loves. Mary Marquardt, the wife of his obscurity, lost to heartbreak. Melissa Matheson, the wife of his triumph, lost to illness and death. Carrie Fisher, the secret flame, gone too soon. His children grew up watching a father often absent, and though bridges were rebuilt, the guilt lingers. Now, as his body slows and the crowds thin, there are evenings on the ranch when silence returns. The same silence that haunted his childhood, the same silence he spent a lifetime trying to outrun. What then is his true legacy? Perhaps not just the smirk of Han Solo or the whip of Indiana Jones. Perhaps it lies in endurance, in the ability to keep moving forward, even when love has fractured, when the body has failed, when time has stolen every illusion of immortality. Harrison Ford is not the invincible hero of his youth, nor the box office king of his middle years. He is something rarer, a man who has walked through fire, 3 marriages, broken bones, near-death crashes, unbearable grief, and still risen, scarred but unbowed. At 83, he stands not as a myth, but as a mirror, proof that even legends bleed, that even heroes grow old, that even myths must bend to time. And perhaps, in the end, what makes Harrison Ford unforgettable is not that he once seemed indestructible, but that he dared to keep going long after indestructibility was gone.